It's summertime, and that means squash season in most gardens. I can't necessarily say all. Now, the challenge with squash is not always growing it, it's using everything you grow. I can tell you that in my family, we have more than we can eat right now, so it's how to save it so we can enjoy it later in the year. Now, you can freeze it, and that's very acceptable. I shred and cube some and freeze it that way. But what I'm doing today is making what is called a mustard pickle. I stumbled upon this recipe. We of course have done more conventional dill pickles with yellow squash, which are fun. They're pretty. I can do a different video with those if I get any requests for it. But what I have found that I use up and ran out of within a couple of months, because when you're talking canning, you're really thinking a year out. What do I need to eat for the next year? So this ran out in just a few months, whereas I still have a few jars of the dilled yellow squash pickles. So this is a two-step process. So the first video is going to be our first step, where we take our squash and chop it up small, get rid of the parts that we don't want. And then we add salt and onions, and this is where we sweat it. This I already did an hour ago, and if you can see the water pooling in the bottom, we want that. That's part of what makes pickles crunchy. You want to sweat some of the water out so that they stay crisp once you preserve them in the vinegar solution. This is considered a pickle because it is preserved in vinegar, but you can tell this one, swish it around, and it's liquid, right? Well, this one is preserved in a gel, much like pie filling. So we get to learn how to use that as well, but that's gonna be in video 2. In video 1, we are going to take squash and get it to here. I've already been working on this bowl. I only have about a quart and a little bit to go of the cubed squash. The one that I am working on right now, I have already partially cut it up, and I've removed the seeds. The seeds, and I never quite understood, because you'll see in recipes they're like, discard the seeds. There's a reason for it. It's because these seeds don't can well, and they get mushy and gross, and you don't want to eat it anyway. So you may as well get rid of it before you start. Now, these big squashes, big ones like this, they have a tougher outside, and they're not quite as tender and sweet as your younger squash, which is why at the grocery store you're gonna find smaller squash. But for canning purposes, for making these pickles, these big, bad, bright yellow, a little bit tougher summer squashes are awesome. And I happen to like the fact that they are yellow, and this particular pickle enhances this. You can make this pickle with cucumbers or with zucchini as well if you want. I just happen to have a plethora of yellow squash, and I like the way it looks. Yellow squash is a humble vegetable, but a nutritional powerhouse. It's chock full of fiber, various water-soluble vitamins, which some of them are diminished when you heat them up and preserve them, but there's still so much good that is still bioavailable even after heating or preservation. All right, see, that was almost a quart. This is a quart measuring cup, almost a quart from part of one of these bigger squash. I'm gonna pick out a big, funny looking one. This is what happens if you get rain and you had some that were about yay big and you leave them for a day. So first things first, top and tail. That step is super important when you're dealing with cucumbers, but it's also important with this squash. Now this one doesn't really have a neck. I guess I can get rid of a little bit, because with summer squash, if you've worked with it at all, you know that the seeds don't start right away. They start where it gets thicker. So this part that has no seeds, I'm gonna deal with it separately. Now I know there's little choppers that you can get that will cube things. I used to have a few of them, but I have cut myself more times on some of the gadgets like that than I have with my knives. So I tend to stick with the knives, and I've taught my kids how to use the knives, mostly because I don't want them to get cut the way I have on some of the other things. But that is completely up to you. If you have a gadget that chops these up into, it's around a 1/2 inch cube. And seeing as our vegetables aren't square, most of the pieces aren't gonna be square either, and that's okay. Now, I know I do have a lot of friends and fellow cooks that like everything super even and perfect, but when we're dealing with something that grows out in the garden, it's rarely exactly the way you expect it. And a lot of the vitamins in these summer squashes are found in this rind, the brighter colored rind. That's where your heavy-duty nutrients other than fiber are found. So you really want to keep that part. So in order to get perfect shape, usually you have to get rid of a lot of the rind. So for me, I prefer to deal with the visual imperfection and keep the nutrition. There's probably 501 ways to remove the seeds from a yellow squash. This is my favorite. You can use a paring knife if you'd like. All I'm doing is scraping, and actually with some of these, I'm going around the outer edge, and then I'll go back. Oh, this one came out really nicely. The bigger ones, the seeds come out easier than the small squash. So that quarter is gonna be ready for me to cut it into strips, and then put it, see, the stem can cause some problems. That's okay, just keep working around. You're gonna feel that the part where the seeds are is mushy and it's spongy. It's not bad and it's completely edible. It's just if you're preserving it or making any form of a pickle with it, it won't make a great pickle. With this, I'm gonna go ahead and compost it, but since it's getting to be the end of the season for some of my bigger yellow squash, from the big squash, like this one that I'm cutting up, and I have a few that are bigger, I'm gonna save some of these seeds because these are ready, after they've dried out for a day or so, they're ready to go right back in, and I can maybe get some more fall squash, or I can save them till next spring. You can toast these seeds like you would a pumpkin seed, but they don't hold up as well to the high temperatures that you would do in your oven. They don't toast quite as well as pumpkin seeds or any of the winter squash seeds. And okay, so winter squash, summer squash. Yes, those are two different things, and it really has to, they're all grown around the same time of the year. My winter squashes are all still on the vine, but they're called winter squash, at least from best I can tell, is because you actually eat them in the winter. You can pick them now, but they need to cure inside, and they do not need to be refrigerated when you keep them, whole inside their pumpkin-y skins or their butternut squash skins. And then you eat them throughout the winter. Whereas summer squash, unless you pickle it or freeze it or something, it will not be here come winter. It is here today and gone tomorrow, unless you either eat it up or preserve it by freezing it, canning it, that type of thing. All right, so we have our quartered, basically strips, and you see how you've got your rind, your vitamin land, and then a bit of the flesh of it, and it's still pretty firm, and that is perfect for what we want with our pickling purposes. Now, I hate to call this a pickle, even though it technically is a pickle. In our family, we don't eat it as a pickle. I put it in stews. If I'm doing beans and rice, I add it to the beans, and it's got the seasoning and everything. It's like, to me, it's like a shortcut, like a recipe shortcut, or my version of boxed food, because it's something that I've cooked ahead, and you'll see that what spices and stuff go into this, but it's got a ton of flavor, and it will actually thicken any stew that you put it in without adding anything else to it. So yeah, we rarely open this, take a fork out, and eat mustard pickles. I think some people do. We just don't, but I found I use this a lot in other things. Hence, it's one that I actually take the time to pickle. All right. Ooh, and we almost have an enough. Now, the most labor-intensive part of these squash pickles is this cubing of the summer squash. But it is worth it in the end. The bite-sized pieces that you're preserving just dump straight from the jar into whatever recipe you're making, and it's no extra chopping. You did the chopping during the summer, so you don't have to do it during the winter. And I find it saves some time. And you get some great nutrition along with it, along with your flavor. It's an easy way to sneak in some veggies into whatever you're doing. So this is, and again, you could do this with zucchini. It's the same process, because when you get zucchini, other than they don't normally have a curve like yellow squash often does. It's the same, taking the seeds out and then chopping and cubing. Cucumbers are the same. Although, even though cucumbers they're loosely related to squash, they will not cross-pollinate with them, and they're actually much closer related to melons. And when I was wondering, I learned about that after we started growing them. I was like, okay, this squash or zucchini or yellow squash, they kind of look like a cucumber, right? But then you look at the plants, and the plants that the cucumbers are growing on look a lot more like what a cantaloupe grows on than what these guys grow on. So I had to look it up. That's a little tidbit. Oh, they're so close. Again, smaller bites, but it's okay if they're slightly irregular. We are going to be putting them in jars, and they actually get a little bit smaller during the sweating process. So let's see where we're at. Yay! Okay, so we have our squash. Now before we sweat it, we need to add onions. I use dehydrated chopped onions or minced onions. If you have fresh onion, that's fine. To do this particular batch, I want a total volume, when I'm starting, before I sweat it, of right around 5 quarts. And that's what this gets me to. So, because I'm adding dry onions, they will fill in the gaps. And some people like more onions. This will give it plenty of zip. But sometimes the onions can be very overpowering, and for some people they upset their stomachs, so that's no good. So then for this volume, we are going to do a 1/4 cup of canning salt. Yeah, you do use salt in preservation unless you're doing pressure canning, but if you're pickling, you have to use salt as a preservative as well as a dehydrating agent when you're dealing with this fruit. Or, well, this is a fruit, yes. So, I added my salt. I have not added any water or vinegar yet. This is just squash, onions, and salt. Now I want that salt to kind of get coating everything, and we're going to let this sweat for an hour. So when we come back, your bowl should look like this step. Remember, this is the one I had to show you. So when you tip it, you see the water. See, I added no water to this. This is all water that has been basically sweating out of the squash. So I'm gonna leave you here and come back to the step 2 or part 2 for this video, and when your squash looks like this bowl. Again, I chopped the pieces the same size, basically the same size, and then look how they kind of got a little bit smaller. They shrunk a little bit. This one's ready to go in the jars and be canned.